Well, good morning, everyone. I want to begin today with a couple of quotes, and one of these you'll recognize if you saw the email that I sent on Friday, announcing today's topic. You read this, but I want to say it out loud, and then also share with you another quote from the individual we're going to be talking about today. Quote, "What he was, he laid aside. What he was not, he became. He took upon himself the poverty of humanity so that I may receive the riches of his divinity." I'll let that sink in for just a minute. He also said this, quote, "That which he has not assumed, he has not healed." That which he has not assumed, he has not healed. These rich little sound bites, as it were, from St. Gregory of Nazianzus point clearly, I think, to the discussions that dominated the age in which he lived. And obviously he is a contemporary of many of the doctors we've talked about to this point. So he's living in that very turbulent age of the church working out these great conflicts and debates and discussions about all sorts of theological issues. Many of the other doctors we've already looked at, of course, did the same. So some of that kind of overview is going to sound a little bit familiar to you. But these great doctors, let's remember what they were doing. They were defining and articulating clearly for us the most crucial first building blocks of our faith. If you think about it, what is our foundational doctrine? What is the primary doctrine of the church? The foundational doctrine is the incarnation. The incarnation. That God became a man. That God became human. So, building on that, you see it's quite natural that in our humanity, questions would persist among us about what that meant about Christ. And then, of course, by extension, what that meant about Mary, the Theotokos, the Mother of God. So both those fields of Christology, which is the study of the person and nature of Jesus Christ, obviously led to Mariology, the study of Mary. And these are the great questions of the age we've been looking at. So what was the relationship of the Trinity? The three persons of the Trinity. What was the nature of Christ? Was he flesh and blood like us, like you and me, as well as fully God? Did he only appear to be human, but was in fact only fully divine? He just appeared to be human. Was he the same being, the same essence, the same substance as God the Father? Was Jesus co-eternal with the Father? In other words, is there a time when Jesus didn't exist? If there is, if he is not co-eternal with the Father, then you see the implication of that is that he must be a created being. And if he is a created being, then how can a created being accomplish the radical work of our salvation as created beings ourselves? Does that make sense? These are the great questions that dominated this entire period. And so the man we're going to talk about today, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, one of the three men we call the Cappadocian Fathers. He also is one, obviously we call them the great Greek doctors in the Western tradition. That's how we refer to them. He is also, sometimes you will see him referred to as Gregory of Nazianzus. And that's because Nazianzus is the area in Cappadocia where he was from. So sometimes you'll see him referred to that way. He is also known, particularly in the Eastern tradition, he is known as St. Gregory the Theologian. We call him, as I said, in the West, he is one of our great Greek doctors, of which there are 3, of course. And this is what the Eastern Orthodox call their 3 great hierarchs. Now, if you were here for Father Jason Foster's presentation on St. Basil the Great last week, or if you've caught that online or on video, you know that in the Eastern tradition, they don't use the word doctor, but they use the word ecumenical teachers. And for them in their tradition, these are the 3 great ones that you see represented here. Is St. Basil the Great, St. John Chrysostom, who we'll be talking about later, and St. Gregory Nazianzus, St. Gregory the theologian. So St. Gregory Nazianzen lived from 330 to 389. So think about, if you place him in the context of that 4th century that we looked at with the great Latin doctors, for instance. He was obviously born 5 years after the Council of Nicaea. He was born in 330. He was born 5 years after the First Council of Nicaea. But the controversies were hardly over. The church that St. Gregory would have grown up in was no doubt still filled with lots of voices of dissent. Even after the First Council of Nicaea formulated our creed, there were still voices of dissent. And as I've said it here before, I think it is sometimes difficult for us in the 21st century to truly appreciate the fluidity of this century, the 4th century, to truly appreciate how the church was living in a time of tension and great fierce intellectual debates, but at the same time being profoundly driven by the Holy Spirit in ways that are so obvious, that give us revealed truths about all these questions I just asked you. All these questions about the person and nature of Jesus Christ. We have that as revealed truth. And it's because of the dedication of men like this who are using their intellect to respond to the call of the Holy Spirit to reveal this truth to the broader church. But I think we don't get that perspective. There's so much of our faith that we recite in our creed that we take for granted, right? We recite that creed, most of us know it by heart. We recite that creed, and when is the last time that any of us, myself included, really stopped on every single line to think about what that really means? That is revealed truth for us. And our faith, I know I've said this before too, although not in this particular case of St. Gregory Nazianzen, but our faith is also bloodstained. That this was a turbulent path to getting to this revealed truth for us, with lots of voices of dissent. You know, when I first had the thought of doing this particular series, some of you will remember that I did a survey in here. I actually did a couple of surveys in here over a year ago now. Remember when we used to have a great group gathering on Sunday morning? And I did a survey of that group, and one of the most common responses that I got from people about what they felt like was missing in their faith formation, or what they felt like they didn't know enough about or wanted to know more about, was precisely this: a look at the early fathers, the doctors, the intellectual framers of the faith. And I think that's because, and everyone who's here, and many of you who are listening know this to be true. Catholics who are committed to fully living into their faith, you already know what I'm getting ready to say. To study these great people of the church is not a history lesson. Okay, Yes, it's a historical view. It's a historical perspective. We may be talking about things in the temporal sense that happened in the past. And so to that extent, yes, it fits the discipline of history. But it's not that. This is our faith. This is our faith, which transcends mere human history. It transcends time. It is outside of time. Both happening, obviously, inside of time, but also outside of time. And this might seem really odd, I know, coming from someone who does what I do. This is going to sound odd coming from someone who is an academic medieval historian in my day job, a church historian. But I can say that sometimes to use the word history for me to describe this type of study actually demeans their work. And don't get me wrong, I love the field of history. I love the discipline. But do you understand where I might be going with this? Because history is about man. History is first and foremost the study of man's progress through time. That's what history is. Right? I would teach that to college freshmen. That's what, if you want to be a historian, that's what you do. You study the events and the people that have shaped civilization, the progress through time. What we have been talking about in here these past 9 weeks is much greater than the limits that man places on himself by calling it the discipline of history, you see. We have been exploring the lives of people who lived temporal lives, yes, but who attest to things eternal. Eternal. The eternal truths of our faith, and I cannot say this enough, they exist inside and outside of our time dimension. Because why? They are eternal. They are eternal. And they are the same in both dimensions. Once we can really begin to grasp that, I think, then the richer and deeper our faith can become. And not to go off on too much of a tangent about this, but you can probably tell this has kind of been on my mind. I know that I'm perhaps biased in this, but I don't believe there's any such thing as being able to say simultaneously, to make this simultaneous pronouncement. I'm a Catholic, I love the church, but I don't really care about the past. Do you know why that's not possible? Because to be Catholic is to be universal. It's to know that we share the same church with everyone who ever came before us in an eternal sense. In an eternal sense. That's a self-refuting statement. To say I am Catholic and I love the church, but I don't really care about the past, is a self-refuting statement. It's to know what we profess. And please God, we never stop learning, right? At least on this side of the veil, we never stop learning. So, in that vein, connecting, I think, some of the dots, there's some interesting points of intersection this week with some things we have talked about before, some personalities we've examined in here before, early in the series. For instance, St. Jerome, who everyone knows by now is one of my favorites. St. Jerome once studied under St. Gregory of Nazianzus at Constantinople, studying the Greek language with him, and he later credited Gregory with increasing his own knowledge of the Greek language, his understanding of the Greek language, which was, of course, so crucial in St. Jerome being able to translate the Vulgate, was to have this greater understanding of the Greek. St. Basil the Great, who we just had the great pleasure and honor of having Father Jason Foster with us from Holy Nativity Orthodox Church, who has studied a lot about the Cappadocian Fathers. St. Basil the Great, remember, was a very good friend of St. Gregory of Nazianzus. The two were educated together in Caesarea. They were schoolmates, for a contemporary term. They were schoolmates together in Caesarea, in Alexandria in Egypt, and then in Athens. So they studied a long time together. Obviously, the language that they were most proficient in was Greek. Contrast that with our Latin doctors, obviously in the West, whose proficiency was primarily in Latin, with the exception of St. Jerome. Their voluminous works were in Greek, as opposed to the Latin Western fathers. So they have St. Gregory of Nazianzen and St. Basil the Great had a close but sometimes very challenging personal relationship, which is obvious when you study them. That makes their relationship, of course, what it is, which is human, broken, trying to do the best they can in a broken world, and living into their individual calls to do the great work they had to do. They had interpersonal struggles for sure. But how rare, think about it, how rare that two men of such fierce intellect and faith would live at the same time and in the same place. Anyway, already I think you can see the hand of the divine at work in that. And I'm reminded, sometimes when I read about these relationships, like for instance, you might recall that St. Jerome and St. Augustine exchanged some interesting letters between each other. St. Jerome always a little more edgy than less charitable perhaps than St. Augustine. But you sense the tension and you know that there's an interpersonal, that human layer that's there. You certainly see it here again with St. Basil and St. Gregory. And I'm reminded, I was thinking about this the other day, of something a much later philosopher was going to say actually belongs to the Enlightenment. And I rarely quote people from the Enlightenment, so this is a rare thing. But it's an Enlightenment philosopher who said something I really love and I think is applicable, even though we wouldn't consider him a man of Christian. He certainly wasn't a Christian. He was a heretical Jew, but more about that if you want to hear it later. There's this quote that all things excellent are rare and difficult. All things excellent are rare and difficult. And I think that's what you see in so many of these interpersonal challenges. Another point of interaction with what we've already talked about before is obviously, as you can tell, the ongoing and ever-present struggle against, anybody want to fill in the blank? What's the name of the heresy? You should know it by now. Arianism, very good. This ongoing and ever-present struggle against that. With these great Latin and Greek doctors, what they all shared was a concern for the unity of the church, the unity of the faith, realizing the great potential that Arianism and other heresies like this, Arianism and another one we'll talk about today, really threatened the body of Christ frighteningly in the 4th century. What they all share is this passion and concern for the unity of the church. There has been so much a part of our discourse over these past 9 weeks, I know, that one might say, well, it doesn't really merit talking about it anymore. And then on the other hand, because it is so crucial, it might merit a re-examination, if only very briefly, because it was such a threat to the faith, a perversion of the truth. And it developed such a large following that persisted centuries beyond the councils that thought they had resolved it. As you're going to see today, it didn't really go away. And this sounded the alarm to every great father and doctor that loved the church, that loved the unity, that understood that unity is the foundational, it's both the foundational principle and the highest principle, is to come together in unity. Remember that Arius, and this is, of course, a quote from St. Athanasius, who was present at the Council of Nicaea, First Council of Nicaea. Actually, of course, remember their charge was to deal with the Arian heresy. And I love this quote of his because he says that there's this great discussion about, well, yes, but if we don't make some concessions, if we don't somehow try to bring these Arians in to the fold, to somehow incorporate their position as well, then we're going to lose them. Right? And this was his response to that. Even if Catholics faithful to tradition are reduced to a handful, they are the ones who are the true Church of Jesus Christ. So, remember that Arius, who was a presbyter, a priest from Alexandria, Egypt, began teaching that Jesus was a created being. That there was a time when Jesus did not exist. He was not co-eternal with the Father, and therefore, not only was there a time when Jesus didn't exist, he was not, therefore, the same, and this is more of a deeper theological issue, but essentially, that if he's not co-eternal, then he couldn't possibly be the same essence, substance, as God the Father. That they were, in fact, different beings, different substances, different essences. Well, obviously, that's important to having discussions about the Trinity, is it not? That the three persons of the Trinity are equal. So, all of these major theological concerns intersected, and Arius brought one of these to a head. The Emperor Constantine the Great, you probably remember, called that first Council of Nicaea as a direct response to this perceived threat to the popularity of Arius' teaching, because it did so threaten the unity of the church. Arius was permitted to speak at the council. He was permitted to stand and give his position, defend his position, but the overwhelming majority of the bishops in attendance, we have the number of 318 that were in attendance, shouted him down, denounced him, and of course Arius ended up being excommunicated from the faith. Now for some of you that's a little review, but it's important for us to always remember that is the working of the Holy Spirit in the church to reveal the truth about the person and nature of Jesus Christ. To weave back in here another name that you've heard me mention before, it was the historian Eusebius of Caesarea. Do you remember that name? Eusebius of Caesarea, who was the historian for the Emperor Constantine. He was present at the Council of Nicaea, and he kept a record. He recorded all of this firsthand in a work called The Ecclesiastical History of the Church from Christ to Constantine. And he's a pretty good observer, you know. Now, there's a common story about that council. A common story is that, of course, while many in attendance were shouting Arius down, at least one bishop knocked him down by punching him in the face. It's a great story, isn't it? Maybe. There is a persistent, this is a 17th century depiction of this scene. There is a persistent and colorfully entertaining story that St. Nicholas of Myra, yes, that's St. Nicholas of Santa Claus fame, that St. Nicholas got so angry at Arius' discourse, his position, after he had spoken and defended his position, and that St. Nicholas got so angry at the division, the seeds of division that Arius had sown in the church that St. Nicholas loved so much, and the unity that he understood to be so crucial. He got so angry that he smacked Arius. Okay? And you know that while I do love a good story, okay, like this, we don't find this anywhere in the primary record. We don't find this story anywhere in the primary record. But you can see it. You see it depicted in art. You see it it's particularly popular in Byzantine iconography, but not for 1,000 years after the Council of Nicaea does it really begin to show up in artwork and in the legend, in the story. It's not in the primary record. Eusebius of Caesarea does not mention this in his account, and one thinks he would likely not have overlooked such a juicy detail, right? Considering the fact that Eusebius has no trouble telling us what all was being brought in every day to eat, right? We know, we got a list of what was being eaten at the council, the food that was brought in, what the emperor was wearing on any given day when he was there. We have all these mundane details. So he even shares some of the conversations he'd overheard in the discussions. So I think he would have mentioned this. But it still makes a great story. And now, in the 21st century, thanks to the wonders of social media, right? Every Christmas, we get to be entertained by artistic creations like this one. Right? Icon of St. Nicholas, Death the Heretic. And so, let me tell you why I think this is so fascinating. You know, none of this happens in a vacuum. This story of St. Nicholas and his concern, going back to this 17th century painting, 17th century, early 1600s, why all of a sudden does this story appear? Incidentally, I should probably tell you, St. Nicholas is not even mentioned. He's not listed in the attendees at the Council of Nicaea. He's not listed among the bishops who attended. So what is behind this 1,000 years after Nicaea? This story emerges of a popular, much-loved bishop physically having an altercation with a heretic. You know, I can't help but think that that has something to do with, when you think about when it appears, about the 15th century, the story first appears, it has something to do with this overwhelming concern for the unity of the church, the unity of the faith. And it emerges, and it's so popular today, as I said, that this is commonly, any of you on social media, I know those of you that are watching on Facebook or on social media, watch around the holiday season and see how often you see this. It's very common now. So I just find that fascinating. But anyway, the Council of Nicaea concluded with the formalization of our Nicene Creed, which was then finalized in its language at the next council, the First Council of Constantinople, which was in 381. You'll remember that when Father Jason Foster was here, if you saw that, he posted on one side the Creed of Nicaea and then how it was finalized, formalized in 381 at Constantinople, with the addition and modification of a few of the words. But it is of course the creed that we use today. So by the year 381, when that Second Ecumenical Council was convened in Constantinople, Saint Gregory Nazianzen had reached already the end of his formal ecclesiastical life at the Council of Constantinople in 381. Somewhat weary, not of the theological battles that he had waged, but of the interpersonal ones within the church. The drama in the church that is so human. He became quite weary of that. For reasons we're going to lay out, you'll see, he stepped away as Archbishop of Constantinople. He stepped away, addressing that council with a very lengthy oration that is included in your reader. His farewell address as the Archbishop of Constantinople is what I included in the reader, because I think well, first of all, I wanted to go for a diversity of things for you to read, not purely theological tomes or entertaining letters like St. Jerome writes about vigilantes. But this one is very, very personal and very emotional and speaks to, I think, the essence of a man who struggled all these years and did what he was never really comfortable with, which was stepping into the fray. He much preferred a quiet lifestyle. And then stepping away at the end of it because he felt like God had called him to do that. So it's included in your reader for that reason. So after studying in Caesarea, Alexandria, and finally Athens, which is where he forged his great friendship with St. Basil the Great, it's also where he most certainly knew, Caesarea particularly, is almost where he most certainly knew the future emperor, Julian the Apostate, who was also a student there. Do y'all remember why he's called the Apostate? Because after a series of Christian emperors, we have an emperor who is not Christian. So the Christian church dubs him the Apostate. But he most certainly knew him. St. Basil the Great certainly knew him. And after he had done this, after he'd studied in these great places, Caesarea and Alexandria and then in Athens, he returned to his homeland of Cappadocia, where he entered a monastery and he began helping out another great theologian of the era, Origen of Alexandria. He helped him compile some of the latter's more important works. And he seems to have really wanted a quiet, contemplative lifestyle. He was not afraid to engage in theological debate or discussion. Obviously, he is remembered as St. Gregory the theologian. But he didn't rush headlong into them. He's perhaps not as tempestuous or impulsive as a Jerome, for instance, who's not going to rush into it. But he didn't really want to be on the front lines either. I mean, he didn't really want to. He didn't see himself as putting himself at the center of these controversies. Circumstances are going to change that for him. And when he was called to do that, when God uniquely called him in a unique circumstance, he did. He responded. You see, in 362, he was ordained a priest, and he worked in and around Nazianzus, which is in Cappadocia region, during the time that his friend Basil was the bishop. The Aryan faction there was quite prominent in this area. Well, really throughout Asia Minor, but particularly in the area around Pontus in Cappadocia. Very prominent there. And Basil really found himself, as bishop, confronted on all sides. Something you may remember, Father Jason Foster really talked about all these different factions that he had to deal with, the Aryans being the most important one. The emperor, the next emperor that in this lineage, the Emperor Valens, who was a contemporary to Basil and St. Gregory, was an Aryan. So, it's like everyone might have gotten excited that we have an emperor who's Christian, but oh my gosh, he's an Aryan, right? So the emperor surrounded himself with people who were like-minded, who were also Aryans. And this is what Basil had to confront as bishop. So even 40 years after the Council of Nicaea, where incidentally Arius had been excommunicated and his teaching had been formally anathematized. Okay, in other words, this will not be taught. It is not tolerated. 40 years after that, this area and others in the East still surrounded by this Arian controversy. The emperor himself and many of the people who were influential and put into positions of authority were also Arians. So St. Basil persuaded Gregory to be consecrated as a bishop, but as soon as somebody else stepped up to take the role, Gregory stepped away and retreated a second time. It's not the last time. Retreated a second time to a monastic lifestyle. And when the Emperor Valens died, seemingly so did the support of the Aryan faction, the Aryan heresy, which had produced a succession of Aryan bishops in this region, including a rather notable one. I'll tell you about him. Rather notable Aryan bishop of this region, a man named Demophilus, whose claim to fame is that he made this pronouncement. I'm going to share it with you. A quote, "Jesus' humanity was lost to his divinity, just as if someone poured a glass of milk into the sea." In other words, that Jesus' humanity could in no way equal his divinity, that he could not be fully human. Okay? And so that's kind of an interesting little blip on the radar screen, because these are, it's an example of the kinds of teaching that men like St. Basil and St. Gregory were confronted with on all sides, on all fronts. But then shortly after, when the Emperor Valens died in the year 378, we have the Emperor Theodosius I. Not only a committed Christian, a committed Orthodox Christian, but an emperor who would take the next step of making Christianity the official religion of the entire Roman Empire, which was the next, of course, major step in its history in the West. It is truly then that we see St. Gregory Nazianzen step back out into the light, if you will. What happens is that right after the Emperor Valens dies and the Emperor Theodosius assumes the imperial throne, Nazianzen loses his good friend St. Basil. St. Basil died. So it is truly then that we see him rather forcefully and with great energy leaning into the role of the voice that would replace that of St. Basil. He stepped up to be the voice of orthodoxy, the voice against heresy, the voice for Nicene Christianity throughout the region of Cappadocia. And then he became the preeminent voice in Constantinople as Archbishop there, with the support of the Emperor Theodosius I, and he preached a series of very notable homilies. There are actually 5 of them that have survived, that are more homilies than that have survived, but these 5 that I'm speaking of, called the 5 Theological Orations. He gave in a series, like a teaching series. And it is probably one of the greatest and richest, to this day, explorations of Trinitarian thought. And let me say this too, the Trinitarian perspective. They are also, remember, they were preached. These were homilies that were preached in Constantinople. These are not theological treatises that he wrote for the greatest minds of his time. They are accessible, they're readable, they're understandable, they're catechetical. He is teaching. He's teaching. And I think, again, still to this day, I think are some of the best resources for that. And did I mention that the Aryan troublemakers have not really gone away? Did I mention that? He's Archbishop in Constantinople. He has the support of the Emperor Theodosius I. Well, there's all sorts of backroom dealings going on in the church as a group of them, a group of Arians, managed to consecrate a rival bishop who was Aryan. And there's obviously going to be a schismatic situation in Constantinople, underway in Constantinople, with 2 bishops. Okay? So you have St. Gregory Nazianzen, who is the true bishop, Archbishop of Constantinople, and you have a man named Maximus, who is an Arian, who a group of other like-minded Arian bishops got together and promoted and actually arranged for a rival consecration. Yes, this really happened. So it does give us the sense, I think, of just how challenging these times were and how much the unity of the church was truly at stake. Therefore, when the First Council of Constantinople met in 381, and St. Gregory Nazianzen showed up as its archbishop, so does the rival, Maximus, who arrived with support. Some of the bishops and presbyters of Egypt, who were also Aryans, of course. We get the sense, and you can read a lot of different interpretations of what is behind the oration that he gave that is in your reader. A lot of different interpretations of this. But we get the sense that St. Gregory was weary. He was weary of all this. Not the theological debate itself. He did not weary of defending the faith. But the ongoing intrigues, the ongoing scheming that undermined the unity of his faithful, his flock in Constantinople. And so he stepped away. Many have criticized this. As I said, you can read a lot of different interpretations of this. But I think you can look at the fruit of the council and see his footprint. You see the impact of his work. And it might give you a little bit different appreciation for him. You see, the Council of Constantinople affirmed 100% the position of the Council of Nicaea. It affirmed the creed, right? The Arian position was again anathematized and repudiated by the universal church. And where do you see this? Where do you see this? Okay, think about the creed that we profess every Sunday. Where do you see the impact, the imprint of these great fathers and doctors in this debate? Every time you say that you believe in one God, right? One, his only Son, Jesus Christ. And how is Jesus Christ described in our creed? Consubstantial with the Father, right? That he is light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made. He's not created, okay? You see, that in that language, you see their imprint. This is what they fought so vigorously for, was the language that came out of Nicaea, First Nicaea and First Constantinople. So St. Gregory Nazianzen's fierce intellectual defense had not gone to naught. The council proves that to us. The council also forbid, incidentally, from this point forward, bishops don't interfere in the affairs of other dioceses. To not extend their influence or control where it didn't belong, recognizing, of course, the authority of a bishop in his own region. The thought that St. Gregory would have shown up at the Council of Constantinople and been confronted with someone who also claimed to be bishop in his region is unthinkable to us, isn't it? It's unthinkable. Because he shares a feast day with his friend, St. Basil the Great, in the West, it's on January 2nd. They share a feast day in the West. They are often depicted together. St. Gregory lived out the rest of his life after the Council in Constantinople in very quiet seclusion, literally, frequently remaining silent for long periods of time, not speaking for long periods of time. He only briefly appears here and there to take on some pastoral duties in the region of Cappadocia. Very quiet, unassuming though in his last years. He with one notable exception I'll mention. He, during this time, also composed poetry, which is quite beautiful, including a lengthy autobiographical one. Well, I say it's autobiographical. Not in the same sense, maybe, of Confessions, but let me get to that point. The poem is called, it's translated a lot of different ways, Thoughts on Self, a Song Concerning Oneself, but he does not separate himself from his complete love of God. So, this is not an all about me poem. Do you know what I mean? It's not an all about me poem at all. It is much like Augustine's Confessions, although it's much more lyrical and it is not a true autobiography in genre, the way that Augustine's is. The same way that one reads Confessions, though, without ever thinking, this is all about Augustine. You know, you don't read Confessions and think this is all about Augustine. No, it's about something much bigger. And the same applies here. This might be a good time for me to stop and say something about, to help us all understand. You know, today we heard that somebody had written an autobiography or somebody had written a poem about, if I wrote a poem that I wanted you to read and I had entitled it A Song Concerning Myself, what would you think? I mean, that to us would seem, I don't know, egotistical, perhaps narcissistic. Our self-focus of the age that we live in would lead us to a very different conclusion than the people who lived before us. And let me explain what I'm talking about. I think it can help us understand the age we live in a little bit better, or the age they lived in, perhaps, a little better in relation to our own. One of the links that I recommended was a 3-part series from Bishop Robert Barron. If you saw that, if you're not on the email thread and didn't see this, there is an excellent 3-part series that Bishop Barron did on the Church Fathers. And in that series, he made an observation that I stopped on and I had to go back and listen to once or twice, because I thought, oh my gosh, he just captured it. This is the essence of something I try to impart to college students every day of my life. And he captured it in a sentence. Something I think extremely important for us to keep in mind. Remember that we do not think, in our age, we do not think as the ancients, the classicals, or the medievals. The way we think about ourselves today is largely the result of 2 major intellectual movements of history that would have been unknown to these people. And I'm talking about the Reformation and the Enlightenment. We are the product of those 2 great movements. The way we think has been shaped by all of the intellectual trends and philosophies that came out of those movements. Right? That shifted the focus from the broad and the general, God-focused view of the ancients, the classicals, the medievals, had this very broad God-focused view, to the very narrow view of the individual. Right? Is this tracking a little bit? Very narrow view of the individual. Today, the individual is the most important focus of our society. The specific is much more interesting to us than the general. The specific is the more important purview to have. Specific meaning my experience, right? Or what is going on in my life, or how I see things. One of the ways you see this, the most telling ways you see this, I think, is if you looked across history and you chose a deep, challenging question that you wanted to ask in the medieval age, and you made some bold statement, I don't know, like the earth revolves around the sun. I'm thinking about Copernicus, right? Copernicus says the earth revolves around the sun. The question to Copernicus was, by what authority do you say that? Right? By the time of the modern age, like after the scientific revolution, then somebody can say, there is 1,000,000, quadrillion, whatever number of galaxies in our universe. And the question is now, where is your evidence? Where is your proof? Do you see the difference? The leap we just made? By what authority do you say it? To where is your evidence? Where is your proof? And what is the question we ask today when confronted with some bold new knowledge? Almost always the question is, well, I don't know. What do you think? It is much more specifically, narrowly focused on the individual. And so that's just to illustrate how far we've come. My point being, going back to St. Gregory Nazianzus, when he's writing about himself, when he's writing about this what we would call an autobiographical poem, he's not writing about himself. Okay? One of the other ways, and y'all just indulge me in this for a minute, because I do think it's important that we keep this perspective about these men of this age. Some people would say that we kind of, going from the general to the specific, that maybe we've lost the big view, we've lost the big picture, right? We're not able to look at things comprehensively or step back and take what we would call a big view without being a challenge for us. You even see this reflected in education, and I think about this all the time. One majors in a subject today in a university, you know this, right? You pick a subject and you major in it. You major in history, you major in English, you major in political science, whatever, biology. And the arts are separated from the sciences, right? In different buildings even, right? The arts are separated from the sciences. When actually that's pretty modern. Before the time of the Renaissance, all the disciplines were integrated. You studied at a university because you were studying in a university, and you studied all of the disciplines. It's the very same reason today, I think, the obvious point is, it's the very same reason that if you earn the terminal degree in any academic field, now I'm not talking about a doctorate, but I'm talking about a PhD. If you earn a PhD in any academic discipline, it is still called a Doctor of Philosophy. Because the ancients, the classicals, the medievals all understood that all knowledge was human knowledge, it was all the same. You didn't separate it out. So again, I think that's a helpful perspective to have. I say that to help us understand that St. Gregory Nazianzus and these great doctors and early fathers of the church would have had no mindset that they could separate their faith from themselves. They could not separate their spirituality from their intellect. They could not separate their love of God from the identity of their very own souls. They could not separate their gifts and their purpose from their person. To be able to do all of that, that's a very modern construct. So, to say that I'm a Catholic, for instance, I'm a Catholic, but I don't believe everything the church teaches. Have you ever heard that? I'm a Catholic, but I don't believe everything the church teaches. I'm not speaking about me, by the way. No. I'm repeating what I've heard. That is also a self-refuting statement. To say that I'm Catholic, but don't believe everything the church teaches is a self-refuting statement. And sure, maybe we struggle from time to time with issues, but being Catholic means submitting our will. It is a submission of our will to something greater, to a greater knowledge. And these men understood this. So whether, when he's writing this autobiographical poetry, it is not poetry about St. Gregory. It is poetry about God. He saw no separation between God and himself. It is about how God was at work within Gregory to reveal to him Gregory's own humanity, because this is how Gregory fulfilled his commission to teach the revealed truth. says God had to reveal to him his humanity so that he could then teach. In the process, he tells us the story of how he experienced the trials and struggles with both loving and hostile personal relationships as he grew toward becoming more like God. A process we don't talk a lot about in our Western tradition. The Eastern Orthodox talk a lot about the process of theosis, growing toward God, becoming more like God. Yet trials and struggles within relationships with those he loved, as I mentioned, he and St. Basil had their moments for sure. But St. Basil's not a hostile figure. He had plenty of people who were hostile to him. It is remarkably readable, again, universal. It speaks to everyone. My favorite takeaway, and it is a rather lengthy poem, but I do highly recommend. My favorite takeaway is what he says, and this is how he says it. It was in seeking Christ that I found Gregory. Gregory was not to be found apart from him. And that's that process I'm talking about of seeking God is the only way to really understand yourself, to really understand humanity, is in relationship to God. Really beautiful, beautiful stuff. Now, near the end of his life, he summoned the strength to mount one more charge against yet another heresy. This time he wrote against Apollinarianism. This heresy was one that taught that although Jesus was a man, he was a human being, he did not have a human mind. He had a divine mind. The mind of Christ was solely divine. And he taught that the two natures of Christ, this humanity and divinity, could not exist, could not coexist in the same person. So the answer for Apollinarius, the heretic here, the answer to him was to reduce or minimize, diminish somehow Jesus' humanity. Because he says that is where sin resides, is in the human nature. So he minimized that. And he even went on to say that if Jesus was both God and man, he would have sinned. Right? So it's not hard to see what the heresy is here. Apollinarianism had been condemned at the First Council of Constantinople in 381, but obviously it continued to rear its ugly head from time to time. The correct teaching, of course, as we all know, is that Jesus is fully God and fully human in a great mystery, a fancy term we call the hypostatic union, right? That Jesus is fully human and fully divine. Those two natures are fully fused in a great mysterious way. Jesus needed to be divine in order to offer himself as the purest sacrifice, and he needed to be human in order to die a human death. This is a revealed truth to us. It's a revealed truth because of the work of men like this. It's part of our sacred tradition. It is expressed in our creed. It is affirmed at the great councils of the church. So we have these great words of St. Gregory Nazianzen. I'm going back to what I said at the beginning. What he has not assumed, he has not healed. But think about that. He took away nothing else today to ponder, think about. Think about that. What he has not assumed, he has not healed. And remember, the context of all it is this great debates that are going on. In other words, he took on full human flesh, our full human condition, to heal humanity. He assumed humanity so he could heal it. By the mystery of the incarnation itself, God fully fused himself with his own created order to heal it. Ultimately, in St. Gregory, we see a man who might have preferred to live the life of a monk over that of an archbishop. He would have preferred a life of silence over speaking the truth that he very boldly proclaimed. Yet, He was a man who answered God's call for the use of his gifts. And when he had done that, God permitted him in his final years to be those quiet ones that he had yearned for. He had that at the end of his life. He died according to the date that we are given. It's reported to us by St. Jerome. St. Jerome is actually a contemporary. St. Jerome is the one who reports his death, and he gave us the year of 389. That this great scholar, this man he greatly admired, had passed into eternity. So, just 3 years before St. Gregory Nazianzen died, let's go to year 386. Just 3 years before, he might have heard, the word about some powerful preaching of a young man just ordained a priest in Antioch that year of 386. The last of the three great doctors we examine, St. John Chrysostom. He may have just begun to hear about this powerful young preacher who earned the name Chrysostom because it means golden-mouthed or golden-tongued. So that's who we'll be looking at next week, the last of the great Greek doctors, the last of these great Greek hierarchs is St. John Chrysostom. So until then, thank you, and thank you very much for joining us, all of you out there too. Thank you.